Hello, good evening, and welcome. It's Friday. It's Friday! Yay! It's the end of another week. Here we all are again at the end of another homeschool week. Yeah, what is there to say? Not quite sure, really. Raining. Been raining, which is good because the garden was very dry. New trampoline still not arrived. Not good. 3 boxes out of 4 delivered, one of which was actually completely destroyed and open. So the reason we're getting one is that the old one actually rusted through. But it wasn't new to us, and we bought it for our son's 3rd birthday, and he's coming up 12. It was second hand then, so it didn't owe us anything. But we were very much hoping to have it last week, and then at least by this weekend. And you know what? We're still a box short. The person who delivered the last box ran away before we could even come out of the house, probably because the box was in several pieces, so whether we've got all the bits that had been in it, we don't know. So it's all a bit annoying, really, but never mind. Given that it's been raining, it matters much less than it might otherwise, because the children don't really want to go in the garden in the rain. We are on chapter 10. Joe and Lucy, because Lucy went with him, Joe had followed Tobias out of the house at some time around midnight and was down in this alleyway. They followed Tobias and some other young men to this alleyway. They appear to be other apprentices, it's not quite clear, but they also appear to have some plot to set fires in Whitehall, which is where the king lives, and Westminster, which is the seat of government, and the Tower of London, which is where they store gunpowder. So if the tower catches fire, that whole side of London will explode. The tower will explode, and that side of London will go up in flames or be blown away, because it's the gunpowder stores. Lucy and Joe have heard some of this, and then Tobias has realised that he's been overheard, and he's caught Joe, who's made enough noise and struggled enough to cover Lucy leaving. Tobias doesn't seem to remember Joe, he doesn't seem to recognise him, which is good, because that means he won't connect him to Lucy. Okay, chapter 10. Joe clawed at Tobias's hand where it was locked around his throat. He couldn't breathe. Tobias loosened his grip, but didn't let go. Joe gulped for air. Us, he got out between gasps. Who's us? Tobias glanced round, then looked again more carefully, peering into the shadows. Let them burn in hell, he thundered. They've run off like whimpering dogs, every last one of them, all because of you. He thrust his face close to Joe's. His breath was sour. You'll have to help me now. Joe tried to think what to do. These moments with Tobias almost always propelled him back into his own world. But he didn't want to go home yet. He wanted more time with Lucy. And he didn't want to have to explain to her parents next time why he'd disappeared from her house in the middle of the night. If only he could find a way of deflecting the older boy so that it didn't happen. Tobias gave Joe a shake. Do I take it from your silence that you're ready to do the Lord's work, or would you rather die here and now? Joe opened his mouth to speak. Die, he said, playing for time. Suddenly, he had a crazy idea. I can't die, he said, trying to make his voice sweet. To die, I would first have to live, but I'm not mortal like you. He felt pleased with himself. Mortal was exactly the right word, especially talking to somebody like Tobias. Mortal was the word they used in the Bible for being human rather than an angel or a spirit or something. He watched hesitation flicker across Tobias's face. Not mortal, the other boy said suspiciously. Then what are you? Your flesh feels solid enough. You look like the rest of us. All the same, he let go of Joe. Joe cleared his throat, determined to seem calm, though his heart was racing. This was a risky plan. I'm God's messenger, he said. An angel, if you like, your guardian angel. Tobias narrowed his eyes. Is that so? He growled. Joe held the other boy's gaze. His lips were dry, but he didn't dare wet them. Maybe this wasn't going to work. It was a pretty long shot, after all. God has sent me to show you the way, his way, he said. He doesn't want you to burn palaces or blow up the tower. Don't you remember what happened to Guy Fawkes? Tobias spat on the ground. Filthy Catholic traitor. Don't liken me to him. He thought he was doing God's work too, Joe persisted. Whatever you think, he believed he was acting in God's name. He warmed to his idea. You know, God sent an angel to stop Guy Fawkes, just like he's sent me to stop you. But Guy Fawkes didn't listen. Don't make his mistake. Tobias gave a high-pitched laugh. Fawkes was in league with the devil, like the rest of his sort. Ours is the true way, and the Lord has made me his instrument. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Tobias's eyes glittered. I've heard God's voice telling me what to do, and if I die doing it, I'll be remembered as a martyr, not a criminal like Fawkes. Joe watched Tobias steadily. The older boy sounded mad. And yet Joe didn't feel afraid now. He must already have won Lucy enough time to get away, and though he would still disappear if Tobias tried to hurt him, that might actually be a good thing. It might make Tobias believe he really was an angel. No, he said coolly, you're wrong. How dare you deny the Lord? Tobias shrieked. He grabbed Joe's arm and twisted it behind his back, as he'd done once before. You're just trying to save your own skin. But it's blasphemy. That's what it is. He sprang round behind Joe. You know what? He snarled in Joe's ear. You can be the one that does the deed. That way you'll be the one with blood on his hands. You'll be the one who'll be hanged, drawn and quartered for it, because you will get caught. I'll make sure that you do. He shoved Joe forward, giving his arm another wrench. Something cracked in Joe's wrist. Pain swirled in his head. He felt dizzy and sick. Any moment now he would hear the hissing in his ears, he told himself. He just had to hold on till it came. Hang on a minute, my son's forgotten that I'm doing this. Oh, or has he remembered? But there was nothing, only distant shouting and singing, the faint crackle of the bonfires, his own stumbling steps, and Tobias's curses as he forced Joe back into the alleyway. In spite of himself, Joe began to panic. Tobias obviously didn't believe he was an angel, and whatever pain he was inflicting on Joe now, there would be much worse to come. Why hadn't he been pulled back into his own world? What if it didn't happen? What if it failed this time? His mind leapt ahead. Tobias might force him to do something terrible, like set fire to a building. He could refuse. He would refuse. But if Tobias put a burning torch in Joe's hand, he could make Joe move it about as he liked. Joe would be little more than a puppet unless he fought back. Concentrating as hard as he could, he blocked out the pain in his wrist and arm. What he was about to do might break his bones, if they weren't broken already. The thought horrified him, but it was his only chance. With the next step, he kicked his foot hard backwards, driving it into Tobias's shin. Before the other boy could react, he flung his body forward and down, as though he was going to throw his opponent over his head. There was a dull, slumping sound, though whether it was him or Tobias landing on something in the alley, he didn't know. His shoulder snapped. A burning sensation shot through his neck and down his arm. Silence fell, soft and black all around him. As he surfaced from the darkness, his first clear thought was that he really ought to take up judo or karate. It would be good to know how to defend himself properly against Tobias. He opened his eyes. He was lying on the pavement on his side. It was daylight. Mum's feet were in front of him. Beyond he saw 2 other pairs of feet. He closed his eyes quickly. If he pretended to be unconscious, there would be time for the nausea to pass before he had to get up. He wondered if he'd dislocated his wrist or shoulder. The pain had been like fire. It didn't seem to hurt now, but until he moved, he wouldn't know for certain. He prayed that he hadn't broken anything. What a stupid thing he'd done. When Jackie Chan threw the baddie over his head in films, he knew what he was doing. Joe snorted. Instantly, his mother dropped down beside him. "Can you hear me, Joe?" She sounded horribly anxious. When he didn't answer, she turned to one of the people standing nearby. "Is he going to choke? He won't swallow his tongue, will he?" "He should be safe," replied a voice. "He's in the recovery position. Look, here comes the ambulance." Joe groaned. "Are you back with us?" Mum asked. "The paramedics will be here in a moment. You're going to be okay." Okay, Joe thought, apart from the fact that he'd wrecked their special day by collapsing not once but twice. The worst of it was, he didn't feel up to carrying on with it now anyway, so they'd be wasting another afternoon waiting around in hospital. He felt tears prickle behind his eyelids. At St. Thomas's, Joe lay on a trolley in the corridor of A&E for 2 hours. Mum hovered beside him, nervous at first, and then more and more frustrated. All the while, doctors and nurses ran frantically to and fro, dealing with patients who were much worse off than Joe. Finally, when he was sure he was feeling better, he persuaded Mum they should leave. "I expect I just need to eat something," he said. "But you'd had a sandwich and a piece of cake just before you fainted." "Yes, but I was still hungry," he lied, "and I'm starving now." He climbed down from the trolley, feeling like a naughty boy climbing out of the window at school. "I'm afraid Joe's discharging himself," Mum said to a nurse hurrying past. The nurse bit her lip. "I'm so sorry you haven't been seen yet," she said. "I'll do my best to make sure someone gets to you soon if you wait a little longer." Joe shook his head. "Don't worry," he said. "I don't want to be a bother to you. I feel fine now." As they stood on the steps outside the hospital, he and Mum looked at each other and began to laugh. "I feel so guilty," she said. "I should have made you stay." "What would be the point?" Joe said. "We know we could have waited for another 2 hours just for someone to check me over and tell me I could go." She nodded. "All the same, let's get something to eat from somewhere else. I'm sure there are plenty of cafes in the hospital, but I'd be looking over my shoulder all the time, waiting to be told off." Joe grinned. "So where are we now?" he asked, as they walked out of the gates. "Where is St. Thomas's Hospital?" "On the south bank of the Thames," Mum said, "next to Lambeth Palace, on the other side of the river from Big Ben and the Palace of Westminster." The Palace of Westminster, thought Joe. That's one of the buildings Tobias wants to burn down. Immediately he shut the thought out of his mind. He really, really didn't want to wind up back there again. Twice in one day was more than enough. It was a couple of days before he dared to let himself think about Lucy at all. He wondered if she'd got home quickly enough to find Tobias's plans, and if so, what she'd done with them. He was sure Tobias wouldn't manage to carry out his threats, but was that because he'd frightened him off? Or had Lucy stopped him? There was no way of knowing. And then, of course, there was the Great Fire itself. In Lucy's world, it had been just over 2 weeks away. Would he be able to get back in time to see it? Maybe there wasn't any point, since he was sure he wouldn't be able to stop it. But it would be a shame to miss it when he'd been so close. As the first week passed, and then the second, Joe began to feel tense. He knew quite well that there was no relationship between the speed at which time passed in Lucy's world and his own. 6 weeks had gone by for her between his first and second visits to Threadneedle Street, when for him it had been less than 2 hours. Equally in Jorvik, it had once been over a fortnight in his time, but only 2 days for her. Still, it felt as though it must be getting close to the time of the fire. At least he'd managed to tell her where and when it was going to start. But then he worried whether she would remember, and if she'd understood what he'd meant by the early hours. What if she thought he meant early in the morning? She might get there to find the fire already blazing, or if she did get the time right, she might get hurt trying to put it out. It was maddening to feel so helpless. He had to do something, but the only thing he could think of was to find out more about the fire. So after school on Thursday, he went to the library. "You're not starting another project now, are you?" the librarian said when she saw him. "It's nearly the summer holidays. Or is this another of your historical crazes? What period is it this time?" "The Great Fire of London," Joe said, ignoring her raised eyebrow. It was starting to annoy him that people thought he was faddish. "Ah, the Restoration," she said. "Restoration?" "The period after Charles II was restored to the throne." Seeing Joe's confusion, she went to a shelf and took a book down. "This will give you the background. In a nutshell, it's this. After the Tudors, Henry VII and VIII, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, came the Stuarts. We had James I, the target of the gunpowder plot, followed by his son Charles I, who was an irresponsible and foolish king." Joe tried to remember what Lucy had said about him. He was sure she'd mentioned him. "Charles had a habit of agreeing to everything people asked," the librarian went on, "even when he was secretly doing the opposite. It's no wonder the country fell into civil war." Joe frowned. Dad had talked about the English Civil War. "Was that the Cavaliers and the Roundheads?" he asked. "That's right. The King's side were nicknamed the Cavaliers, and Oliver Cromwell and the Parliamentarians were the Roundheads. They wanted to get rid of the monarchy altogether." Joe suddenly remembered Lucy asking if he was a Roundhead because his hair was short. She'd looked worried, he recalled. Presumably then her family were supporters of the king. And hadn't Oliver Cromwell been a Puritan, like Tobias? That must be another reason why Tobias hated Lucy's family so much, not only because William was a mercer. It made more sense now. "The English Civil War went on for nearly 10 years, on and off," said the librarian, "but eventually the Roundheads won. Oliver Cromwell was one of the men who signed Charles I's death warrant." "Oh, yes!" Joe exclaimed. "That was why the next king had Cromwell dug up and his head put on a pole, wasn't it?" The things Lucy had told him were falling into place now. He felt a stab of regret that he hadn't got to see Cromwell's head after all. Perhaps they might go and look at it next time, whenever that was. The librarian smiled. "That's right. When Charles I was executed," she said, "his son, Charles II, escaped to France. Famously, he hid in an oak tree to avoid being caught. While he was away, Oliver Cromwell defeated the last of the Cavaliers and ruled over England as Lord Protector until he died. After that his son took over, but he was weak and useless, so Charles II returned from France in 1660, and voila, you have the Restoration." She made a gesture with her hands like a magician producing doves from a hat. What a peculiar woman, Joe thought. "I've always thought the Restoration period would have been quite fun," she was saying, "if you exclude the plague and the fire." Joe blinked. Those were pretty big events to exclude. "Why is that?" he asked. "It was the time of pleasure," the librarian said. "Charles II was nicknamed the Merry Monarch, you know. If you really want to get a feel for what life was like then, you should read Samuel Pepys's diary. It's all on the internet. Fascinating stuff. Joe thanked her and took away a stack of books. He knew she was just trying to be helpful, suggesting the diary, but he couldn't see how it would tell him much that he didn't already know. On the way home, he found himself mulling over what she'd said about it being a time of pleasure. That was what had made Tobias so furious, people enjoying themselves. That was what he wanted to punish. In a way, Joe thought, it was like religious extremists in his own world, hating the West for being decadent. And like the terrorists on the news, Tobias was determined to do something about it, even if that meant dying himself. For a second, Joe's blood seemed to stop moving. How had he not recognised the parallel? He'd been distracted by the fact that Lucy's world was a different time, yet Tobias's intentions were the same. He was planning to kill the king, burn down Parliament and blow up half of London. That was nothing short of an all-out terrorist attack. Cold crept over Joe's skin. He'd never expected to actually meet a terrorist. But that was what Tobias was this time, a religious fanatic, hell-bent on punishing his enemies. And worst of all, he was living in the same house as Lucy. Fear flared inside Joe. He'd felt brave for spinning out those minutes behind the Pewters' Hall with Tobias, even though it meant physical pain. He'd been glad to gain Lucy some time so she could run home and search for Tobias's plans. Yet he'd known all along that he wouldn't have to face the consequences. How had he not seen that he was leaving his dearest friend to prevent a terrorist attack on her own? He'd abandoned her to face a danger even greater than the Great Fire itself. What if Tobias had got back to the house and caught her? Even if he hadn't, he might still suspect she knew. What if she hadn't managed to find the plans? Then she would have followed Tobias when he went out again in the night. Only this time, she would have been alone. Joe longed to get back into Lucy's time more than ever before. He thought about her as often as possible and wished there was something else he could do to make it happen. Sitting on his bed at home, he took out a pencil and paper and tried to draw her. Without a photograph to copy, the picture wasn't very good, but it was something he could carry in his pocket. In the meantime, he hoped fiercely that she wasn't in any danger. And please, 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 he thought, let her think of me again soon. It's funny, isn't it? When we think about Guy Fawkes, sometimes we might be tempted to think of, our sympathies to be engaged with the fact that he was in a persecuted minority, persecuted for reasons that seem very irrational. He was not allowed to follow his own religion. Catholics were not allowed to worship. And that, to many of us, seems really quite peculiar, and therefore it's easier to sympathise. But it comes down to the same thing as what Joe's just recognised about Tobias. It is actually out-and-out terrorism. If you try to kill the king and destroy the government or the parliament, that is terrorism. And that is exactly what Tobias has in mind. And will Lucy stop him? Because Joe knows it won't have happened because the tower's still standing. It can't have happened. But has it not happened because Lucy has stopped him? And in trying to stop him, has she put herself in too great a danger to survive? Until she thinks of him again, if she thinks of him again, he won't know. And of course, if she has taken Tobias on and put herself in grave, grave danger, and Tobias has killed her, she will never think of Joe again. And then he'll never go back. You'll have to come back on Monday to see if that's what's happened. On Monday, we'll have chapter 11. In the meantime, I wish you a very pleasant weekend.